On the night of October 7, 1966, a rented station wagon broke through the iron gates of Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, and crushed the man who had just stepped out of it to open them. The man was Eduardo Tirella, a 42-year-old set designer. The woman behind the wheel was the richest heiress in America. The Newport police took 72 hours to call it an accident. They never gave her a sobriety test. They never convened a grand jury. And for the next 27 years, the woman who killed Eduardo Tirella was never asked a single hard question about that night. If you enjoy the stories the official record does not want to tell, the deaths that closed too quickly and the inheritances that paid for the silence, subscribe to Old Money Corrupts so you do not miss what I uncover next. Chapter 1. The 12-year-old heiress. She was 12 years old when her father died, and left her $100 million and a country that would never let her forget the number. The date was the 10th of October, 1925. James Buchanan, Duke, known to everyone as Buck Duke, lay in a bedroom on the second floor of his Fifth Avenue mansion. Outside the heavy curtains, the city was already calling reporters. A photographer from the New York Daily News had been stationed on the sidewalk for 2 days. Buck Duke was the man who had built the American Tobacco Company into a near monopoly, controlling roughly 4/5 of the United States cigarette market. He had bought up the railways of the Catawba River Valley and turned the rivers into electricity. He had endowed Duke University with a gift of $40 million only the year before. When he died, the country knew exactly how much had been built. The only question was, who would receive it? The will named one principal beneficiary. She was sitting in a chair beside the bed. Her name was Doris. Doris Duke had been born on the 22nd of November, 1912, in a 16-room apartment on the Upper East Side. Her mother was Nanaline Holt Inman, a Cole, Georgia widow her father had married late in life. Her father called Doris his second chance. She had no brothers, no sisters, no rival to the inheritance. By the time she was old enough to understand the words trust and principle, every newspaper in the country had calculated the figures for her. $100 million in 1925, money was an almost incomprehensible sum. Adjusted for inflation, it would be the equivalent of more than $1.5 billion today. It was many times the personal wealth of any sitting United States senator. It was greater than the cash holdings of most established banks. It was more than the entire annual budget of the United States Department of Agriculture. The press did not know quite what to do with the figure, so it did the only thing it knew how to do. It made the figure a person. The phrase, "the richest little girl in the world," began to appear in headlines within 48 hours of Buck Duke's death. It was used in the New York Times, in the San Francisco Chronicle, in the Atlanta Constitution, in the London Times. A wire service photograph from the funeral procession showed Doris standing beside her mother in a black coat that came down to her ankles. The caption did not give her age, it gave the dollar amount. She would carry that phrase for the rest of her life. She would carry it through Brearley School, through her debut at Rough Point in 1930, through 2 marriages and several lovers, through the wartime ambulance routes of Egypt and Italy, through the gates of her Newport estate on the night that a man named Eduardo Tirella stepped out of a station wagon and never stepped back into one. She would carry it onto her death certificate in 1993, when newspapers from Auckland to Tokyo would dust off the same phrase and print it on top of her obituary. The fortune itself was structured to survive her. Buck Duke had not built it across 40 years to watch it dissipate in a single generation. The trust agreement filed in surrogate court in Manhattan in November 1925 placed the principal under the control of a board of trustees who would distribute income to Doris through her 20s and would release blocks of the principal to her at 21, 25, and 30. The Duke Endowment, the separate vehicle her father had created in 1924 to fund Duke University and a network of Methodist hospitals and churches in the Carolinas, sat in its own legal silo. Neither vehicle could be drained by a husband, neither could be touched by a court-ordered divorce settlement except at the margin. Buck Duke had locked the fortune in a vault and given his daughter a key that could be turned but never broken. What he had not done, and what no instrument could ever have done, was give her a life that did not start with that figure on top of it. In the days after the funeral, the trustees met. Doris was told to wait in the library. Her mother sat with the lawyers. The arrangement settled within an hour. Doris would continue at Brearley. Doris would summer at the Rough Point cottage in Newport her father had bought in 1922. Doris would not be permitted to give interviews. Doris would not be permitted to handle her own correspondence. Doris would not be permitted to be a child. She had become, with the stroke of a fountain pen on a will in October 1925, the most observed 12-year-old in the United States. When the lawyers left, she went upstairs. There is no photograph from that evening, but the household chef later remembered that she had refused her dinner and asked for the dogs to be brought up to her room. She slept that night with two of her father's hounds at her feet. It is the last documented moment in her life when no one was angling for a share of the inheritance. The next morning, the audience had assembled. Chapter 2. Brearley and the Whispering Daughters. At Brearley School in Manhattan, she sat among the daughters of mortal millionaires and listened to them whisper about the size of her trust. Brearley was, in the 1920s, the most exclusive girls' school in the United States. It occupied a Georgian building on East 83rd Street. Its students included a Roosevelt, two Vanderbilts, a Whitney, a Phipps, and several Astors. The annual tuition in 1927 was approximately $1,400, a figure that would be enough to keep a working family fed and housed for 2 years. The girls arrived in chauffeured cars. They had French and Latin and elocution and watercolor. They had no boys. Doris arrived at Brearley wearing the same uniform as the others. She was tall. By 13, she stood 5 feet 11 inches. By 15, she had reached 6 feet. She was conspicuous in every photograph, the tallest girl in every line. Her hair was dark blonde, her eyes pale blue, her face long and angular. She was not considered pretty by the standards of her class. The press had already conferred on her the title of the richest little girl in the world, and that phrase, in the corridors of Brearley, was used as a small weapon. The whispering began on her first day. A Vanderbilt cousin of approximately her age remembered, decades later, that the girls calculated her allowance against their own. A Whitney granddaughter recalled that Doris was not invited to certain birthday luncheons because, as one mother had put it, "We cannot keep up." Another Brearley student told a biographer in the 1970s that Doris had once arrived at school crying and had refused to say why. The teacher had pressed her, and Doris had finally answered, "They say I am only friends with them because I am paying for it." Her mother did not help. Nanaline Holt Duke had married Buck Duke after the death of her first husband, the Atlanta cotton merchant William Inman. She was 20 years younger than Buck Duke and had a son by her first marriage, Walker Inman, who lived as Doris's older half-brother. Nanaline was practical, ambitious, severe, and entirely uninterested in the inner life of a child. When Buck Duke died, Nanaline regarded the trust as her trust. When Doris cried, Nanaline regarded the crying as a discipline problem. The result was that Doris learned very early the survival skill of the wealthy heiress. She learned not to trust the people who said they loved her. She learned to read a room for what each person in it wanted from her. She learned that the answer to nearly every social question in her life was money, and that the only way to know whether someone valued her for herself was to refuse to spend any of it on them. By the time she was 16, in 1928, she had developed 2 private worlds inside the public one. The first was animals. She kept a kennel of dogs at every house. She kept a stable at the Duke Farms property in Hillsborough, New Jersey, the 2,740-acre estate her father had assembled before her birth. She bred Persian cats. She filled the conservatory at the New York mansion with songbirds. The animals were the only beings in her household who did not know how much money she had. The second was music. She studied piano with a German tutor named Anneliese Berger from the age of 10. By her early teens, she was working through Chopin and Debussy. She had a strong contralto voice and joined the chorus at Brearley. Music gave her, for the first time, a measure that was not denominated in dollars. A passage was played well, or it was not. Bach did not care about the trust. When she came out as a debutante in the autumn of 1930, the public storm broke over her again. Her mother hosted the ball at Rough Point in Newport. Approximately 500 guests attended. The orchestra was the Meyer Davis Ensemble, the same group that had played at the wedding of Cornelia Vanderbilt earlier that year. The newspapers reported the orchids, the bottles of champagne, the gown, and again, the figure. The Boston Globe printed "Richest Girl in America Comes Out." She danced the first dance with her mother's stepson, Walker Inman. She danced the second with a Newport cousin whose name has been lost. She danced the third with a young man from Philadelphia she had never met before, a son of the Stotesbury banking family. His name was James Cromwell. 5 years later, he would be her husband. 8 years later, he would be filing for divorce. She did not yet know that. She was 18. She was the tallest woman in the ballroom. She was, as the orchestra played the Strauss waltz that her mother had specifically requested, the largest unmarried fortune in North America. Every man in the room could see it, and almost every man in the room was already calculating. Chapter 3. The First Husband, Hunting Her. Like game. Jimmy Cromwell did not pretend to love her for very long, and the marriage was a contract dressed in white silk from the day it was signed. James Henry Roberts Cromwell was the stepson of Edward T. Stotesbury, the senior partner of Drexel and Company, and one of the wealthiest investment bankers in Philadelphia. He was tall, handsome, fluent in French and Italian, and almost entirely without independent means. His mother, Eva, had married Stotesbury after the death of her first husband, the millionaire Oliver Cromwell. Jimmy inherited the surname, the social standing, and the expensive habits, but not the principle. By the time he was 30, he was already known as a man whose ambitions ran ahead of his bank account. He met Doris properly in the autumn of 1932 at a Palm Beach dinner. By the following spring, he had taken to visiting the Duke family in New York for tea. By the summer of 1934, they were openly being seen together at restaurants. Friends warned her. Her mother warned her. The columnist Charlie Knickerbocker wrote in a coded item that the Duke heiress was currently keeping company with a most ambitious young Pennsylvanian. Doris read it and tore the page out. The engagement was announced in December 1934. The wedding took place at the Duke Farms mansion in Hillsborough on the 13th of February 1935. The bride wore a white satin gown by Bergdorf Goodman. The groom wore a morning coat. Approximately 250 guests attended. The reception cost, by one estimate filed in a later divorce action, $60,000, the rough equivalent of $1 1/3 million today. The press, of course, attended in a parallel ceremony of its own, with the Associated Press photograph distributed by wire to almost every major American daily. Within 48 hours, the couple boarded a chartered yacht in Miami and embarked on a round-the-world honeymoon that lasted 9 months. The honeymoon was, in retrospect, the high point of the marriage. They sailed across the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific to Honolulu, on to Tahiti, to Sydney, to Bali, to Bangkok, to Cairo, to Athens. They visited the Maharaja of Jaipur, who gave them an elephant. They visited the Sultan of Jogjakarta. They visited the pyramids. Doris, who had never been entirely happy in society, was, for the first time in her life, anonymous. No one in Bali knew the figure on her trust. No one in Bangkok had heard the phrase, "the richest little girl in the world." She bought small ceramics in every port, the early objects in what would become the Shangri-La collection. The trouble began on the way home. Jimmy Cromwell had, all along, intended to enter politics. By the late 30s, he was openly campaigning for a Democratic seat in the United States Senate from New Jersey. The campaign required money. Senate campaigns in New Jersey cost, in the late 1930s, between $40,000 and $75,000 a year to mount seriously. Doris paid for it. She paid for the offices. She paid for the staff. She paid for the printing of pamphlets. She paid for a country estate at Bernardsville, New Jersey, that was supposed to anchor him to the state. He lost. President Roosevelt, who had grown fond of Cromwell, offered him the consolation prize of a diplomatic appointment as minister to Canada in 1940. Cromwell accepted, moved to Ottawa, and immediately began to behave as if his diplomatic income, rather than Doris's trust, was supporting him. She had begun to understand by then that her husband had not married a person. He had married a budget line. The other women started in 1937. There was a Washington socialite, then a Hollywood actress, then a Canadian diplomat's wife. Doris, in turn, took her own lovers. She had a long affair with the Hawaiian Olympic swimmer Duke Kahanamoku, whose name she had taken to dropping into conversations about Honolulu. She had a brief affair with the actor Errol Flynn. She had, depending on which biographer you trust, an affair with a much older General George S. Patton during a Cairo passage in 1943. By 1941, the marriage was a legal fiction. By 1942, they were separated. In May 1943, in Reno, Nevada, the divorce was granted on the grounds of mental cruelty. Doris paid Jimmy Cromwell a settlement that the trust records list as approximately $1.5 million, equivalent to roughly $27 million today. The trustees who had argued against any payment at all were overruled by Doris on the simple ground that paying him to leave was cheaper than fighting him in court. The first husband took the check. He never spoke unkindly of her in public. He went on to a second wife, to a quiet retirement in Pennsylvania, and to a long old age in which he occasionally told dinner party stories about the elephant in Jaipur. He died in 1990. He was 93. Doris, watching the limousine carry him away from the lawyer's office in Reno in May 1943, made herself a promise that she kept for the rest of her life. The next time she married a man, she would do it with eyes open. She would do it knowing the bill was coming, and she would, this time, refuse to be surprised by the price. She would marry exactly once more. The man was Porfirio Rubirosa. The bill came 13 months later. She had no cause to be surprised. She had, in a way, ordered it. Chapter 4. Shangri-La and the Pacific Escape. She built a palace on a Honolulu cliff and filled it with Islamic art, because the world's most expensive house was the only place no one in New York could find her. The decision to build in Honolulu came on the round-the-world honeymoon. In April 1935, Jimmy and Doris had stopped over in Hawaii on their way to the Far East. She had fallen in love with the climate, the ocean, and a young Hawaiian beach boy and swimmer named Duke Kahanamoku. She had also fallen in love with the idea of being entirely beyond the reach of Newport. She bought a parcel of approximately 5 acres on a Diamond Head clifftop overlooking the Pacific. She paid $100,000 for the land, and over the next 2 years, she commissioned the architect Marion Sims Wyeth, a Palm Beach designer, to build her a house. The house was completed in 1937. The total construction cost was approximately $1.4 million, the equivalent of around $31 million today. She named it Shangri-La after the fictional Tibetan paradise in James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. It was, from the moment of its completion, the strangest private house in the Pacific. The structure itself was modernist, low-slung, white-walled, terraced down the cliff face, but the interiors were a deliberate immersion in the artistic traditions of the Islamic world. There was a Damascus room with carved and painted wooden panels of the 17th century, bought in Syria during the honeymoon. There was a Mughal-style suite with marble inlay floors. There was a courtyard with a reflecting pool and tile work copied from the Alhambra. There was a private bathing pavilion with an underwater glass window that allowed the bather, in theory, to be observed from below by an audience of fish. Doris had not yet developed her serious knowledge of Islamic art. She would acquire it in the late 1930s and 1940s, principally through a sequence of 3 trips to Cairo and through correspondence with the Egyptologist Mahmoud al-Batta and the architectural historian Stuart Cary Welch. By the 1960s, the Shangri-La collection would contain more than 3,500 objects, including 13th century lusterware tiles from Iran, an 18th century Damascene fountain, a series of 17th century Mughal portraits, and a fragment of the prayer rail of the Topkapi Palace. The collection would be valued, after her death, at several $100 million. The collection was not, however, the primary purpose of the house. The primary purpose was escape. In Honolulu, no one called her the richest little girl in the world. She was Doris, who surfed at Waikiki with the local boys, who paid for her drinks with cash, who walked into the small Chinese groceries on King Street and bought her own provisions. She was Doris, who could be seen at the swim club on most mornings doing freestyle laps in a black one-piece. She was Doris, who hosted small dinners on the terrace at Shangri-La and refused to invite anyone she had met in Newport. The Pacific gave her something New York and Newport had never given her, which was the freedom to be ordinary, or as ordinary as a 6-foot heiress with a $1.4 million Islamic palace could be. Her friendship with Duke Kahanamoku was central to the Hawaiian years. Kahanamoku had won an Olympic gold medal for swimming in the 1912 Stockholm Games. a silver in 1924, and was widely credited with bringing surfing to the modern world. He was 22 years older than Doris. He was also Hawaiian, dark-skinned, and the son of a minor royal family that had been displaced when the American government annexed the islands. In the racial climate of 1935, Hawaii, a public friendship between a 6-foot white heiress and a native Hawaiian Olympic medalist was conspicuous. They surfed together, they had dinner together. There is enough physical evidence in their correspondence to confirm a romance, although the precise dates and depth are disputed by Kahanamoku biographers. Shangri-La functioned in those years as a fortress against her own life. The house had no telephone for the first 3 years. Mail had to be carried up the long driveway by hand. There was no cable address. The only way to find her in Honolulu was to know where she lived, and the only way to know where she lived was to have been invited there. The trustees back in New York were not happy. They argued that the cost of the construction was excessive, that the upkeep was extravagant, that the climate was bad for paintings and textiles, that the property was vulnerable to the next Pacific War. Doris ignored them. Buck Duke's will had given her the absolute right, after the age of 25, to spend her income as she chose. She had reached 25 in November 1937, 3 months before Shangri-La was finished. She spent. The deeper question, which she could not yet articulate, was whether escape from New York was the same thing as freedom. She was free of her mother. She was free of the trustees. She was free of the Newport season. She was not, however, free of the inheritance itself, because the inheritance was the condition that had built the cliff and the courtyard and the underwater window. Wherever she went, the trust came with her. Whoever she befriended would, sooner or later, learn what her name was. By 1939, even in Honolulu, the columnists had begun to find her again. A small piece in the Star Bulletin reported that Mrs. Doris Duke Cromwell has been entertaining at her cliffside villa. The phrase Mrs. Cromwell cracked something open in her. She had built Shangri-La to be free of her marriage, and the local paper had reduced her to it in a single line. She closed the house for the season and went back to New York. The marriage, by then, was already corpses on a shore. The other thing waiting for her was the war. Chapter 5. The Daughter Who Lived a Day. Arden was born in July 1940 and died before her mother had ever held her, and that loss is the silent wound under every later decision. Doris had become pregnant in October 1939. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. She suffered from severe morning sickness, then a recurring high blood pressure that her physicians, in the medical practice of that era, were unable to manage. By the early summer of 1940, she was being monitored daily at her Duke Farms residence in New Jersey. The plan was to deliver at New York Hospital in Manhattan in early August. The baby came 2 months early. On the 7th of July, 1940, Doris went into premature labor at Duke Farms. She was rushed to Doctors Hospital in Manhattan. The delivery, by the standards of 1940 obstetrics, was a near catastrophe. The infant, a girl of less than 3 pounds, was placed immediately into an incubator. Doris was sedated. Jimmy Cromwell, who had been in Ottawa attending to his diplomatic post, did not arrive for nearly 36 hours. The baby was named Arden. 24 hours after her birth, on the 8th of July, 1940, Arden died. The medical staff, following the protocol of the era, did not allow Doris to hold the body. The baby was wrapped in a white blanket and taken to the hospital morgue. Doris was given a heavy dose of barbiturate. Cromwell signed the necessary documents. The body was transported 2 days later to the Duke family plot at the Duke Memorial Methodist Church in Durham, North Carolina, and was buried there in a small ceremony attended by approximately 15 people. Doris did not attend. She was still in the hospital. The grave is marked with a small marble stone that reads only Arden Cromwell and the 2 dates. The stone is approximately 18 inches tall. Doris would visit it at irregular intervals for the next 53 years. The loss of Arden marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The medical recommendation, given to her by 3 different obstetricians in the autumn of 1940, was that she should not attempt another pregnancy. The combination of her high blood pressure, the prematurity, and what the doctors of that era still called the danger of advanced maternal age at 27, made a second attempt, in their judgment, too dangerous. She accepted the recommendation. She would never again attempt to have a biological child. She would, in 1988, at the age of 75, attempt to fill the place Arden had left empty by formally adopting a 35-year-old Indian-American dancer named Charlene Hefner. The adoption would be a disaster, but the impulse, 4 decades after Arden, was the same impulse. She wanted a daughter. In the weeks after Arden's death, Doris withdrew. She returned briefly to Honolulu. She closed Rough Point for the summer of 1940. She stopped accepting social invitations. The columnists who had reported the pregnancy with their usual eagerness were quiet about the death. Walter Winchell ran a single discreet line. The New York Times printed a 4-line obituary on page 32. The figure on the trust was not mentioned. The marriage to Cromwell did not survive the loss. He had not been in the hospital. He had not been in the country. He had been entertaining a Washington socialite at his Ottawa residence, a fact that one of his diplomatic secretaries quietly relayed to a Duke trust officer in November 1940. The trustees passed the information to Doris without instruction. She did not act on it for another 2 years, but the marriage, in her own mind, had ended on the 8th of July, 1940. The war saved her, in a way. By the time the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, she had been quietly volunteering for the Foreign Affairs Service through a contact in Washington. She wanted to be of use somewhere. Her name was not the leading fact about her. The State Department sent her, in 1944, first to Cairo, then to Rome, in the role of a junior canteen organizer for American servicemen. The official record describes her as a Red Cross volunteer. The unofficial record, recovered by later researchers, suggests that she also carried sensitive correspondence between American diplomats and that she was, on at least 2 occasions, briefed by the Office of Strategic Services for limited courier duties. The full extent of her wartime intelligence work has never been declassified. She also, during the Cairo posting, took up with a man who would become one of the strangest figures in her life. General George S. Patton, the famously profane American tank commander, was in Cairo for several weeks in early 1944 for command consultations. He was in his late 50s, married, and one of the most powerful generals in the American Army. He was, by all accounts of the witnesses still alive in the 1970s, smitten with Doris. She was 31, he was 58. They are documented as having dined together at the British Embassy on 2 occasions and as having walked alone on the Corniche near the Mena House Hotel on a Friday evening in February 1944. Whether the affair was consummated is impossible now to establish. Patton would die in a road accident in Germany in December 1945. Doris would say in a private letter to a friend in 1968, only that Cairo gave me the man I should have married, and he was not for sale to anyone. She came home in late 1945. She was 33 years old. She had buried a daughter. She had divorced a husband who had cost her $1.5 million to remove. She had served, in some capacity she did not entirely understand, on 3 continents. And she had decided, against the advice of every trustee and every friend, to marry again. The man she had chosen was Porfirio Rubirosa. Chapter 6. The Rubirosa Bargain. In Polo Ponies. She married the Dominican playboy Porfirio Rubirosa in Paris in September 1947 and divorced him 13 months later for the price of a private aeroplane. Porfirio Rubirosa. Ariza was born in San Cristobal, Dominican Republic, in January 1909. By his late 20s, he had become a personal favorite of the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, who had appointed him a diplomat, married him briefly to his own daughter, Flor de Oro, and continued to keep him on the Dominican payroll long after the marriage ended. Rubirosa was charming. He was an expert polo player. He was a competent racing driver. He was rumored in the more candid Parisian salons to be physically equipped in a manner that several biographers have addressed at unconvincing length. He had no money of his own. He was, by the autumn of 1946, openly hunting an heiress. He met Doris at a party in Paris in late 1946. He had been pursuing the tobacco heiress Doris Duke in conversation for almost a year before he found himself in the same room as her. She was 34, he was 37. He was approximately 5 inches shorter than she was. They danced, by one witness account, only once that evening, but he left the party with her telephone number at the Ritz. The courtship was rapid. Rubirosa was a master of a particular kind of European courtship that involved arriving every evening with a small, extravagant gift, a single perfect tea rose or a Cartier cigarette case, and disappearing every morning before the maid arrived. He was disarmingly honest about being broke. He was disarmingly honest about being a former employee of a dictator. He was disarmingly honest about having married Flor Trujillo for her father's money. The honesty itself was a strategy. By acknowledging the obvious, he made the next inconvenient question, which was whether he was after Doris's money, somehow unnecessary to ask. Doris asked it anyway. He told her yes, of course he was. But he was also, separately, in love with her. She believed him because she chose to believe him. Her friends warned her. Her mother sent a transatlantic telegram begging her not to do it. The Duke trustees in New York convened an emergency meeting in August 1947 to discuss whether the trust could be restructured to deny Rubirosa any access. The lawyers concluded that with proper prenuptial documents, the marriage could be quarantined from the principal. The wedding took place at the Dominican consulate in Paris on the 1st of September, 1947. Doris wore a gray suit by Balenciaga. Rubirosa wore his diplomatic uniform. There were approximately 12 guests. The American press, locked outside on the street, photographed the limousines. The Associated Press wire that evening carried the phrase, recycled from 22 years before, "The richest girl in the world has married again." What the trustees had not been able to control was the prenuptial agreement Doris herself had signed in July 1947 in a Paris lawyer's office without notifying New York. The document, which is still preserved in the Duke family papers at Duke University, granted Rubirosa, in the event of a divorce or her death, an immediate cash settlement of $500,000, a 5,000-acre plantation in the Dominican Republic, a Paris townhouse at 54 Rue de Bellechasse, an annual allowance of $25,000, and certain personal effects to be itemized later. The personal effects in the next 12 months would prove to be where the real money was. The marriage began collapsing within 90 days. Rubirosa, who had a long-established mistress in Paris named Danielle Derieux, did not stop seeing her. He traveled to Argentina for a polo season in early 1948, took up with the actress Ziza Gabor, and was photographed embracing her on the deck of a yacht in Buenos Aires harbor. The photograph appeared in Life magazine. Doris, in Honolulu, opened her copy of Life and saw her own husband with another woman. She filed for divorce on the 15th of August, 1948. The proceedings were settled in Reno on the 27th of October, 1948. The settlement, in addition to the prenuptial cash, included the following itemized personal effects: a string of 17 polo ponies, 2 custom-built Ferrari sports cars, a converted Mitchell B-25 bomber that Rubirosa had taken to flying himself, the Paris townhouse mentioned in the prenuptial, an additional 13-acre property near Saint-Cloud, a small Picasso drawing from the bedroom at the Rue de Bellechasse, and a Cartier emerald and diamond bracelet she had given him as a wedding present. The total value of cash and chattels has been reported in figures ranging from approximately $1 million to $25 million in 1948 currency. The lower figure is closer to the documentary record. The higher figure was almost certainly inflated by Rubirosa in conversation with friends. The marriage had lasted 13 months and 26 days. Asked years later why she had done it, Doris gave 2 different answers to 2 different friends. To the jazz pianist Joe Castro, she said, "I wanted to know what it would cost to buy a man who already had a wife." To her childhood friend, the Newport socialite Eileen Slocum, she said, "I wanted to see if I could love a man knowing exactly what he was." Both answers are probably true. Both answers were the answers of a woman who had concluded, by the age of 35, that the only honest transaction available to her was the one in which the price was negotiated openly, and the goods were known to be cheap. She had paid 2 husbands to leave. She would never again pay a third. The remaining 45 years of her life, from the autumn of 1948 to the autumn of 1993, would not contain another wedding. They would, however, contain Eduardo Tirella. Chapter 7. Eduardo Tirella, the friend she could not buy. For 6 years, Eduardo Tirella was the closest thing to a peer Doris Duke had ever permitted in her own home. He was born in Dover, New Jersey in 1924, the son of an Italian immigrant family that ran a small fruit and vegetable store on Blackwell Street. He grew up speaking Italian at home and English everywhere else. He had a natural eye for arrangement, color, and proportion. After the war, in which he served briefly in the army, he moved to New York and worked first as a window dresser at Bonwit Teller and then as an assistant to the designer Tony Duquette. By the mid-1950s, he was working in Hollywood, designing sets for film productions, including the Natalie Wood comedy Sex and The Single Girl. He had also developed a quiet sideline as a curator and advisor to wealthy clients on their decorative collections. He came to Doris in 1960 through a mutual friend, the actress Peggy Lee. She had been looking for someone to take charge of the slow reorganization of Duke Farms, the New Jersey estate, where her father's antique European furniture, her own purchases from years of travel, and a growing collection of garden statuary had piled up in storage. She offered Tirella a 6-week contract. He stayed for 6 years. Their working relationship deepened into something that resembled, for the first time in her adult life, an authentic friendship. He was openly gay. He was therefore one of the very few men in her orbit who was not, by definition, a potential romantic partner or a potential exploiter of her marriageability. He had no fortune of his own and no interest in pretending otherwise. He had taste, intelligence, and a sharp, dry wit that could puncture her grander moods without offending her. Friends from those years describe him as the only person at Duke Farms who could correct her in front of staff and get away with it. He once, in 1963, returned a Louis Quinze console table she had bought in Paris, with the simple comment that it was a Victorian reproduction. She was angry for an afternoon. She was grateful for a decade. He was the only advisor she ever fully trusted to tell her she had been swindled. Their work expanded across all of her properties. Tirella helped to reorganize the Islamic collection at Shangri. He directed the redesign of the gardens at Duke Farms, working with the landscape architect Robert Zion. He oversaw the placement of the European sculpture at Rough Point. He cataloged the Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels jewelry inventory across the 3 houses, an undertaking that ran to several hundred pieces. By 1965, he was, in effect, her chief of staff for the visual life of the entire Duke estate. He was paid a salary the trust records list as $24,000 a year, plus expenses. This was, in 1965, money, a very comfortable salary for a single man, the equivalent of around $200,000 today. It was also a fraction of what he could have earned in Hollywood, where the studios were courting him with set design contracts that would, by 1966, exceed $80,000 per film. He told her, in late summer 1966, that he was going to take the Hollywood work. The conversation occurred in early September of that year, at the Duke Farms residence in Hillsborough. Tirella, by his sister Ann Yarrow's later account, had decided some months earlier that the Hollywood opportunities were too significant to refuse, and that, at 42, he had to commit to building his independent career. He intended to leave Doris's full-time employ by the end of 1966. He would remain a friend. He would remain available for consultation. But he would no longer be her chief of staff. He was, in his own words to a Los Angeles friend, tired of being a guest in someone else's life. Doris did not take the news well. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten him. She simply, in the days after the September conversation, became withdrawn and cold. She canceled a planned trip to Honolulu. She fired 2 assistants whom Tirella had hired. She instructed her Beverly Hills attorney to make discreet inquiries about whether Tirella had been quietly meeting with other potential employers in Los Angeles. On the morning of Friday, the 7th of October, 1966, she flew with Tirella from New York to Newport, Rhode Island in a chartered aircraft. They arrived at Rough Point in the late morning. They were to spend the weekend together, going through a final list of objects in the Newport collection. Tirella was scheduled, on the following Monday, to fly to Los Angeles to begin the new chapter of his career. The household staff at Rough Point that weekend included the chef Francis Cornand, the housekeeper Mary Walsh, a maid named Brenda Lyle, and the head gardener Charles Tony Bouchard. All 4 would later give statements to the Newport police that night, and again to the police investigators in 2020. All 4 reported that Doris and Eduardo had argued during the day, that voices had been raised in the library after lunch, and that the conversation had concerned Tirella's planned departure. At approximately 5:05 in the afternoon, with daylight fading, Tirella told Doris he needed to drive down to the front gates of the property in the rented Dodge Polara station wagon to open them so that a delivery vehicle could pass. He left the house alone. Doris, the chef would later say, came out of the house 10 minutes later and walked down the driveway toward the gates after him. The next confirmed event occurred at approximately 5:15 in the afternoon. Chapter 8. The Station Wagon That Did Not Stop. At twilight, on the 7th of October, 1966, a rented station wagon accelerated through the front gates of Rough Point and dragged Eduardo Tirella beneath it. The gates of Rough Point in 1966 were wrought iron, mounted on heavy stone pillars, set across the entrance to the property at the top of a paved driveway that ran approximately 120 feet from the front of the house down to the street known as Bellevue Avenue. The driveway even today has a slight downward slope from the house to the gates. The gates themselves opened inward toward the property, so that to leave the estate, a car had to push them outward, and to enter, a person on foot had to unlatch them and swing them open. The rented car was a 1966 Dodge Polara station wagon. It was a heavy vehicle, 15 feet 4 inches in length, with an automatic transmission of the torque flight type and a 318 cubic inch V8 engine. It had been rented by Tirella that morning at the Providence airport. The events of the next minute were reconstructed badly by the Newport police in the 72 hours that followed, and were reconstructed more thoroughly by the police review team in 2020. According to the original Newport police report dated the 10th of October, 1966, the sequence was as follows. Tirella drove the station wagon down to the gates. Doris was in the passenger seat. Tirella stopped the car approximately 10 feet inside the gates, with the front bumper facing them. He stepped out of the vehicle to unlatch the gates. Doris slid across into the driver's seat. The vehicle then, the report stated, lurched forward unexpectedly due to a malfunction of the accelerator linkage, striking Mr. Tirella and continuing through the gates and across Bellevue Avenue before coming to rest against a tree on the opposite side. Tirella, who had been opening the right-hand leaf of the gate, was struck by the front of the vehicle, dragged beneath the chassis as the car continued forward, and crushed against the gate as it broke through. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy was performed by the Newport County coroner, Dr. Frederick Patterson, on the 8th of October. Patterson recorded the cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries consistent with being run over by a heavy motor vehicle. The injuries listed in his report included a crushed pelvis, fractures of every rib on the left side, a ruptured liver, a ruptured spleen, fractures of both femurs, and a fractured skull at the base. The injuries were not consistent with a single sudden impact and arrest. They were consistent with the vehicle running over the body, which in turn suggested that the vehicle had passed not only into Tirella, but across him. The Newport police, however, did not conclude on the basis of the autopsy that this was anything other than an accident. They did not question the household staff in any depth. They did not interview Tirella's family. They did not test the accelerator linkage of the Dodge Polara, although the same vehicle was returned to the rental agency 2 days later, repaired, and put back into the rental fleet. They did not test Doris Duke for alcohol. They did not require her to give a recorded statement. Lieutenant Frank Walsh, the lead officer, took a brief handwritten note in which Doris stated, in summary, that Mr. Tirella stepped out of the vehicle to open the gates, the car moved forward on its own, I attempted to control it, but could not. That statement, by any standard, raised more questions than it answered. If Tirella had stepped out to open the gates, why was Doris in the driver's seat? If the vehicle had moved forward on its own, why had it broken through the gates with sufficient force to cross Bellevue Avenue, a distance of approximately 45 feet, and embed itself in a tree? If she had attempted to control it, why was there no evidence of braking on the driveway? The Newport police asked none of these questions in October 1966. The household staff statements, recovered in 2020, paint a different picture. Frances Cornan, the chef, said she had heard raised voices in the house after the lunch and before the death. Mary Walsh, the housekeeper, said she had seen Mrs. Duke walk fast down the driveway after Mr. Tirella, walking with her arms held close, the way she walked when she was angry. Charles Tony Bouchard, the head gardener, who was clipping a hedge approximately 20 yards from the gates, said he had heard the engine of the station wagon race, the way it does when somebody pushes the pedal to the floor before the car shot forward. None of these statements were included in the original Newport police report. The household physician, Dr. John McAllister, was summoned to Rough Point that evening. He gave Doris a sedative. He told the Newport police she was in no condition to be questioned further. She was not questioned further that night, nor the next day, nor the day after that. By the morning of Monday, the 10th of October, the Newport police had filed their report. By the afternoon of Monday, the 10th of October, the file was closed. By the evening of Monday, the 10th of October, the rented station wagon was on its way back to the Providence Rental Agency for repair. Eduardo Tirella was buried at Locust Hill Cemetery in Dover, New Jersey, on the 12th of October, 1966. Approximately 90 people attended. Doris Duke sent flowers. She did not attend the funeral. She was, on that morning, in Manhattan, meeting with her attorneys. Yes, at Chapter 9. 72 hours and a closed file. The Newport Police Department classified the death as an unfortunate accident within 72 hours and never reopened the file in her lifetime. The mechanism by which this happened is not, as later commentators sometimes claim, primarily about a bribe. There is no documentary evidence that Doris Duke handed cash to any police officer in 1966. The mechanism was, instead, structural. It was about who paid the salaries of the police officers, who owned the cottages on Bellevue Avenue, who employed the housekeepers and the chefs and the chauffeurs, and who was, in the end, a citizen of Newport, whose institutions were calibrated to serve the rich. The Newport Police Department in 1966 had approximately 57 officers. Its budget, drawn from the Newport city government, was supplemented by donations and by political pressure from the cottage owners on the cliff. The chief of police, James Tobin, had been in his post for 11 years. He had grown up in Newport. His own brother-in-law worked as a groundsman at the Wrightsman property 2 streets from Rough Point. The investigating officers, Lieutenant Frank Walsh and Detective Sergeant Edward Waller, had each spent their entire careers in Newport, knew the cottage circuit, and knew, with the small-town clarity that no formal training can replace, that nothing useful to their careers would come from pursuing a homicide charge against the richest woman in America. What was useful to their careers was a quiet, quick conclusion. The accident report served that need. The Tirella family lived in New Jersey, knew almost no one in Newport, and could be expected to be slow to respond. The household staff at Rough Point were on contracts that included a confidentiality clause. The medical staff at the hospital were professionally discreet. The rental agency was paid quickly for the damaged car. Within 72 hours, every loose end that could be tied off was tied off. The Tirella family did not accept it. Ann Yarrow, his sister, went to Rhode Island in the second week of October 1966 and tried to see the police file. She was told that the case was closed and the file was not available to the public. She went to the local newspaper. The Newport Daily News ran a short article on the 11th of October, 52 lines, reporting the accident in the language of the police statement and did not mention any of the household staff observations. The article ran on page 7. By the following week, the story had vanished from the Newport press entirely. The Tirella family hired a New Jersey lawyer named Charles Murphy and filed a civil action against the Duke estate in Rhode Island State Court in 1971 for wrongful death. The complaint requested damages of $1 million. The Duke estate, defended by the New York firm of Cravath, Swain, and Moore, responded with a robust denial of liability and a series of procedural motions that stretched the action across 3 years. The matter was settled out of court in 1974 for $201,000, distributed among Tirella's 6 surviving siblings. The settlement carried no admission of fault. The settlement included a confidentiality clause. The settlement closed the legal door on the question for the next 46 years. In her private life, Doris Duke spoke of the death once, that I can establish from the available record. In 1979, in a letter to her childhood friend, the Newport socialite Eileen Slocum, she wrote, "I have many regrets, and Eddie is the chief of them. The car was newer than I was. That is the only thing I can honestly say. The car was newer than I was, and on that evening, I was not." The letter survives in the Slocum papers at the Newport Restoration Foundation. It is the only direct admission in writing or in the recorded conversation of any contemporary that Doris Duke was at any point aware that the official account of the night was not the account that had happened. In October 2020, the Vanity Fair journalist Peter Lance published a multi-part investigation that had taken him years to assemble. He had located the original household staff. He had recovered the autopsy photographs. He had pieced together the timeline of the gate, the driveway, the engine sound, the absence of brake marks. He had presented his findings to the current Newport police chief, Gary Silva. Silva ordered a review of the case file. The review team, working with the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, concluded after 3 months of analysis that the original Walsh and Waller investigation had been inadequate, that no sobriety test had been administered, that no grand jury had been convened, that the physical evidence was not consistent with an accident, and that, in the words of the review's final summary statement, this case today would likely be treated as a homicide. Chief Silva said, at a press conference on the 7th of October, 2020, the 54th anniversary of the killing, that the original investigation did not meet the standard of a thorough criminal inquiry. No criminal charge could be brought. Doris Duke had been dead for 27 years. The relevant officers of the Newport Police Department were either dead or retired. The rented station wagon had long since been scrapped. The 2020 review concluded with the explicit acknowledgement that the killing of Eduardo Tirella would never be formally adjudicated in any criminal court. The accident that had taken 72 hours to close had taken 54 years to be plausibly described in the only word it had ever deserved. She did not need to be acquitted. She was never charged. Chapter 10. The Irish Butler at Falcon Lair. By the time Bernard Lafferty walked into her household in 1987, there was almost no one left in her life who was not on her payroll. She was 74 years old. Her mother had been dead for 25 years. Her closest friends were either dead or estranged. Her one biological child had lived a single day in 1940. Her adopted daughter, Chandi Duke Hefner, taken on in 1988 at the age of 35, would within 5 years be expelled from her life under accusations that ranged from theft to brainwashing. The only stable presence in her household was the staff, and the staff, by the late 1980s, was constantly turning over because Doris had developed the habit of firing employees on a whim and rehiring them by telegram a week later. Bernard Lafferty arrived through Peggy Lee, the same singer who had, 27 years earlier, introduced Doris to Eduardo Tirella. Lafferty had been Lee's hairdresser. He had then been Ginger Rogers' butler. Lee, in a phone call to Doris in early 1987, recommended Lafferty as a discreet, competent personal aide. Doris invited him to her Beverly Hills residence Falcon Lair for an interview. He arrived in a borrowed dark suit. He told her about Donegal, where he had been born in 1945, and about his childhood as one of 9 children in a Catholic family. He was, in the language Doris understood, a man of no means and no obvious ambition. She hired him. Within 6 months, he was sleeping in a room adjacent to her bedroom. The role expanded across the next 4 years. Lafferty became the primary intermediary between Doris and the outside world. He sat in on her telephone calls with the trustees of the Duke estate. He was present when her physicians visited. He filtered her mail, opened her invitations, and quietly began to refuse, on her behalf, social engagements she had once kept. By 1991, he was signing checks on her household account. By 1992, he had been added as a co-signatory on certain trust disbursements. By the spring of 1993, when she signed the final version of her will, he had been named, in writing, as her co-executor. The trustees in New York were uneasy. 2 of them, Robert Bayard and Frank Cromer, raised concerns in writing about Lafferty's background. They cited his lack of formal education, his admitted history of credit card debt, and the accelerating pattern of staff dismissals he had presided over. They suggested in a memorandum dated the 7th of November, 1992, that Doris be evaluated by an independent physician. Doris read the memorandum, took it personally, and dismissed the suggestion. She was, in her own description, perfectly competent to choose the people I want in my home. The household at Falcon Lair, in those final years, was a strange court. Lafferty ran the day-to-day schedule. A small staff of nurses, including one named Tammy Payette and another named Marion Oates, attended to Doris around the clock. Her personal physician, a Beverly Hills internist named Charles Kiewicz, made daily visits. The maid count varied from week to week as Lafferty hired and fired. Visitors were rare. Old friends from Newport, from Honolulu, from her wartime years in Cairo were turned away at the door, or were told, by Lafferty, that Mrs. Duke was not well today. She was, in fact, increasingly unwell. She had broken her hip in a fall in 1991 and had not recovered her mobility. She suffered from chronic congestive heart failure. She had developed a dependence on a combination of opioid painkillers and benzodiazepine sedatives. Her diet had collapsed into a regime of milkshakes and small portions of ice cream. By the spring of 1993, she weighed approximately 110 pounds on a frame of 6 feet. In April 1993, she signed the final version of her will. The document, drafted by a Los Angeles attorney named Lowell Bergman, named Bernard Lafferty co-executor of her estate alongside the United States Trust Company. It named Lafferty a trustee of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, the philanthropic vehicle that would inherit the bulk of her fortune, with an annual trustee fee of $100,000. It provided Lafferty with an additional bequest of $500,000 in cash and the use, for life, of a rented apartment in Beverly Hills. It excluded entirely her adopted daughter, Chandi Hefner. She had, in the language of every 20th century probate observer, signed her household over to her butler. She had 6 months left to live. Chapter 11. The Morphine Drip and the Locked Door. In the last weeks of her life, she was kept in a darkened bedroom, hooked to oxygen and a morphine drip her butler controlled. The final illness began in late September 1993. She had developed, in addition to her existing congestive heart failure, a chronic pulmonary congestion that her physicians could not stabilize. She was unable to walk. She was, on most days, unable to sit up unaided. She was placed on a continuous oxygen supply. Dr. Kivowitz ordered intravenous fluids, antibiotics, and, for pain management, intravenous morphine on a slow drip. The control of the drip, in the daily routine of Falcon Lair, fell to the nurses. The nurses reported to Bernard Lafferty. The witnesses to those last weeks have left a complicated record. Tammy Payette, one of the duty nurses, would later sell a tabloid account to the National Enquirer in 1994, claiming that Lafferty and Kivowitz had ordered escalating doses of morphine. Marion Oates, another nurse, gave a sworn statement to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office in 1995, corroborating parts of Payette's account, but disputing others. Dr. Kivowitz, in interviews, defended his prescribing as appropriate for the standard of pain management for a terminal patient in heart failure. The bedroom at Falcon Lair, during those weeks, was kept dark. The heavy curtains were drawn. The Spanish tile floor was muffled by heavy carpets. The only light came from a small lamp on a side table and from the green glow of the medical monitors. Visitors were not permitted. Lafferty controlled access. On at least 2 documented occasions, in early October 1993, longtime friends of Doris, who had flown to Los Angeles specifically to see her, were told at the door of Falcon Lair that Mrs. Duke was sleeping and could not be disturbed. She died at approximately 5:05 in the morning on the 28th of October, 1993. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Kivowitz, attributed the cause of death to progressive pulmonary edema secondary to dehydration and septic shock. The certificate did not specifically mention the cumulative morphine dosage. The body was cremated within 48 hours at Bernard Lafferty's direction, at a Los Angeles crematorium that had been chosen by Lafferty without consulting the trustees in New York. The ashes were placed in an urn and, eventually, scattered at sea off Diamond Head in Honolulu, in accordance with what Lafferty stated were Doris's wishes. The probate fight began within weeks. Chandi Duke Hefner, the disinherited adopted daughter, filed a challenge to the will in November 1993. Her counsel argued that Doris had been under undue influence from Lafferty, that the April 1993 will had been signed when she was no longer mentally competent, and that the cremation had been arranged to prevent a forensic examination of the body. The case ran for years across Los Angeles Probate Court and New York Surrogate Court. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office opened a parallel inquiry in 1994. Investigators interviewed Payette, Oates, Kivowitz, and Lafferty himself. They reviewed the medical records. They considered whether to bring charges of elder abuse or homicide. In December 1995, after 14 months of work, District Attorney Gil Garcetti announced that no charges would be brought. The official statement read, in part, "The evidence is inadequate to support a charge of homicide. Although the standard of care in the final weeks fell short of the level the public has a right to expect for any patient, however wealthy." The probate fight was settled in 1996. Chandi Hefner received a final cash settlement reported at $65 million. Lafferty retained his co-executor position. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation was endowed with the residual estate, an initial endowment of approximately $1.2 billion that would grow over the next 3 decades to $1.7 billion by the year 2024. Bernard Lafferty himself did not enjoy his bequest for long. He died of a heart attack at his rented Beverly Hills apartment in November 1996 at the age of 51. The coroner's report cited acute alcohol intoxication as a contributing factor. He had drawn approximately $220,000 in trustee fees and additional payments from the Duke estate in the 3 years between Doris's death and his own. The richest girl in the world was gone. The butler was gone. The household was sold off. Falcon Lair was eventually demolished. The only thing left was the institution and the gates. Chapter 12. The Gates That No Longer Exist. In October 2020, 54 years too late, the Newport Police Department admitted that the killing of Eduardo Tirella would today be treated as a homicide. The press conference at which Chief Gary Silva made the announcement took place at the Newport Police Department headquarters on the 7th of October 2020, in deliberate timing with the anniversary of Tirella's death. Vanity Fair had published the Peter Lance investigation only a few weeks earlier. The reading of the original case file by the Contemporary Review team had been completed. The Rhode Island Attorney General's office had quietly concluded that no criminal action could be brought against a defendant who had been dead for 27 years, and against witnesses who were almost all in the grave. Ann Yarrow, the sister who had spent 54 years trying to get someone in authority to acknowledge what had happened to her brother, was 89 years old at the time of the press conference. She watched the live feed from her home in New Jersey. She was reported to have wept. She said, in a statement carried by the Associated Press, that "This is the answer we have waited for the entire adult lives of my brother's surviving siblings." She died 14 months later, in December 2021, at the age of 90. The wrought iron gates of Rough Point, where Eduardo Tirella was crushed on the 7th of October, 1966, were replaced in 1973 as part of a routine maintenance project undertaken by the Newport Restoration Foundation, the institution Doris Duke herself had founded in 1968. The replacement gates are similar in design, but are not the same gates. The original gates were sold for scrap. There is no surviving piece of the iron that killed him. Rough Point itself is now a historic house museum, open to the public from spring through autumn. The standard tour passes the entrance gates without comment. The standard guidebook makes no mention of the night of the 7th of October, 1966. The institutional silence around the killing was, until 2020, almost as complete inside the foundation as it had been inside the Newport Police Department. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, by contrast, has flourished. Its grants since 1993 have totaled more than $2 billion in support of medical research, the performing arts, child well-being, and environmental conservation. The Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art operates Shangri in Honolulu as a working scholarly collection that hosts visiting researchers and produces serious academic catalogs. Duke Farms in Hillsborough is now a public park and environmental education center. 3 serious institutions, each of which performs work of genuine public benefit, have been built on the assets that survived her. It is the central, irreducible contradiction of her life. She did good, and she did harm in measures that cannot be netted against one another, because the lives are not interchangeable. The grants that fund a cancer research laboratory in Boston do not bring Eduardo Tirella back to Dover, New Jersey. The lusterware tiles at Shangri-La do not unwrite the 72-hour Newport police report. The $65 million paid to Chandi Hefner do not pay for the years of isolation in the darkened bedroom at Falcon Lair. The fortune was real. The damage was real. Both went on simultaneously and continue to operate in different ledgers today. What her life shows, if you are willing to look at it without flinching, is that vast inherited wealth does not solve the problem of being a person. It only changes the cast of characters in the room and the price of their silence. A 12-year-old girl can be handed $100 million, and she can be made, with that single gesture, into a person who will live and die surrounded by people who are paid to be there. The institutions she funds can be magnificent. The funeral can be private. The press releases can be tasteful. The work of the foundation can be world-class. None of it makes the room less full of paid strangers. She had used money to make the world look away from her. On the night of the 7th of October, 1966, and the world had agreed to look away because the world is built that way. She had used money to bring people close to her in the household at Falcon Lair in 1993, and those people had been close enough to control the drip of the morphine, the locking of the bedroom door, the cremation of the body, and the destination of the ashes. The same currency had bought both transactions. It was always going to. In a small Dover, New Jersey cemetery, the marble headstone over Eduardo Tirella reads simply his name and the 2 dates. It is approximately the same height as the marble headstone in Durham, North Carolina, that marks the grave of Doris Duke's infant daughter, Arden, who lived for 24 hours. 2 graves, 50,000 miles of property between them, and the same fortune behind every event in both lives. That is the verdict of the Duke inheritance. That is what $100 million in 1925, compounded across 7 decades, finally produced. If you want to know what the money bought, look at the gates that no longer exist. Look at the daughter who never had a chance to be held. Look at the foundation that gives away $1.7 billion while a sister in New Jersey waits 54 years to be told what her brother already knew. The Duke fortune bought everything except the one thing none of it could ever purchase. It bought everything except a witness. If anything in this story stayed with you, I would like to hear which moment cut deepest. Tell me in the comments, when you imagine Doris Duke at the wheel of that Dodge Polara on the 7th of October, 1966, do you see a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, or a woman who had been kept so far from consequence she no longer believed it could find her? Subscribe to Old Money Corrupts so you can join me for the next case, where the names